For those of you in Year 8 heading towards your Common Entrance Latin examinations in June, there is really very little left for you to do besides repeated practice via past papers and significant revision of vocabulary, grammar and Greek mythology. To that end, I want now to go through sections A and B, the vocabulary and the grammar, within my revision booklet for levels 1 and 2. And if you look underneath this video, you'll find a link where you can download a copy of this PDF if you don't already have one. First of all then, section A, from pages 5 through to 9, consists of all the vocabulary required for level 1, printed in black ink, and level 2, printed in red. First of all then, verbs. As you should know by now, verbs in Latin are divided up into 4 major categories. These categories are called conjugations, and to conjugate a verb is to list its various endings. First conjugation verbs are defined by having an A stem. Amo, amare, amavi, amo, amas, amat. A stems. The second conjugation, meanwhile, has E stems. Mon eo, mon ere, like so. Moneo, mones, monet. So the first conjugation has A stems, the second has E stems, and then the fourth conjugation has I stems. Audio, audire, audio, audis, audit. A, E, and I. Now the third conjugation, meanwhile, doesn't have any particular kind of stem. They're basically all the freakier verbs that don't fit into the first, second, and fourth conjugations. Finally, we have the so-called 3.5 conjugation. Technically, this is known as the mixed conjugation. The 3.5 nickname comes around because in their indicative forms, now remember, the indicative mood is for factual statements, while the imperative mood is for giving orders. Indicative forms of 3.5 conjugation verbs, so the basic tenses, present, future, imperfect, perfect and pluperfect, operate in the same way as the fourth conjugation. Note, like the fourth conjugation, they have these I stems in their root or present stem. But then their infinitives, like capere here, and their imperatives operate like the third conjugation. So they're a slightly odd hybrid between the two. Finally, we have a little handful of irregular verbs. Perhaps most importantly, the verb sum, the verb to be, which has an irregular infinitive esse and a peculiar perfect stem as well, fu. There are then 3 compound forms of sum. A compound verb is a verb which has a little bit stuck on the front called a prefix, which can either work in an emphatic way or it can change its meaning, as it does here. So, ab sum, I am away, ad sum, I am present, and then possum, I am able, which is usually followed by an infinitive, I am able to do something. The Romans were able to escape. Another such irregular verb is eo, I go. Now, eo doesn't often come up in its simplest form. Much more frequently, it's met in compound form. There are a number of compounds of eo here, almost all of which are logical in their meanings. So, eo is I go, thus ex eo is I go out, eo and ex. Likewise, in eo, I go in, red eo, I go back, and trans eo, I go across. Just one compound of eo you need to be careful with, and that's per eo. Logic would suggest that it means I go through, but it in fact means die or perish, as opposed to go through permanently. So don't forget that slightly strange meaning. But the rest of them are all logical and pretty friendly. Finally, there's inquit and inquiunt, which are verbs of speaking, and they come up outside of direct speech. And lastly, noli singular and nolite plural. Don't do something. Literally, be unwilling to do something. They're followed by an infinitive. Nolite oppugnare, don't attack. They're called negative commands or prohibitions. On to the next page, nouns. Now, just as verbs have a number of grammatical properties, verbs have number, singular or plural, person, first, second or third, and tense, present, future, etc. And we discussed mood as well, the fourth property of verbs, whether it's indicative or imperative. Now, nouns too have a set of grammatical properties. Just like verbs, they have a number. Nouns can be singular or plural, logically, and in fact we can see that early on in this first vocabulary list. Agricola, farmer, is singular, there's only one farmer, whereas copiae, troops, are plural. In fact, copiae are always plural. It's not possible in Latin to say troop. Secondly, they have a gender. Masculine, feminine, neuter, which means neither masculine nor feminine, and common, which means either masculine or feminine. For example, incola, a native or inhabitant, is common, because we're all inhabitants of wherever it is that we live. Some of us are male inhabitants and others are female inhabitants, so it's said to be a common noun. Now, where verbs are divided into conjugations, nouns are divided into declensions. There's actually 5 declensions in Latin, but you only need to know the first and the second for level 1, and then the first, second and third for level 2. First declension nouns are almost all feminine. The only exceptions, other than incola, which I just mentioned is common, the only other exceptions, I'm afraid to say, are on the grounds of sexism. Agricola, a farmer, nauta, a sailor, and poeta, a poet, are all masculine because I'm afraid the Romans considered those to be masculine or male roles. But the rest of the time, nouns ending in a are feminine. We can see that some of the time this is logical. So, Ancilla, a slave girl, Dea, a goddess, Femina, woman, Philia, daughter. It makes sense that those are feminine because they're women. The rest of the time, it's more a case of having a grammatical gender than one which is logical. Aqua, water, is feminine. It doesn't have any particularly female attributes, but the fact that it's a first declension noun means that it becomes feminine. As you can see, these various genders are given using the little letters in brackets. Now, the first declension is comparatively simple. They all end in A. The second declension is a bit more pesky because it is subdivided into 4 further categories. The vast majority of second declension nouns end in us, and they operate like dominus, a master. Here's a list of them: amicus, cibus, deus, dominus, etc. They are all masculine. A tiny handful of second declension nouns in Latin are feminine, but none of them come up at common entrance. So as far as you're concerned, all the us-type nouns are masculine. Once again, sometimes that makes sense, like deus, a god, dominus, a master, servus, a slave, but other times it's a grammatical gender because they are in this particular declension. Now, a very small number of second declension nouns end in and there's 2 types of those. Most of them operate like magister, a schoolmaster, which has what's called a contracted stem. Magister, magistri. The stem of magister shrinks down. Likewise, aga, a field, liber, a book, that gives us library, just as aga gives us agriculture, and magister, schoolmaster, we've already mentioned. There are a tiny handful, though, that operate like pua, a boy. He doesn't contract. Pua, pueri. And liberi, meaning children, and vir, a man, operate in the same way. Finally, for the second declension, there are those that end in like bellum, meaning war, and they are all, without exception, neuter. They're neither masculine nor feminine. They are things, objects of some description. The third declension is a little more pesky, in the sense that there's no way of logically forming its stems. For the first declension, mensa, the stem is mens. For dominus, domin. For bellum, bell. Magister contracts, magister. Pua doesn't contract, pua. For the third declension, we have to acquire the stem From this second form here, the genitive singular, we remove the is, and that gives us the stem. Kiv, clamor, comet, conjugue, and so on and so forth. And it's for that reason, I'm afraid, if you're doing level 2 CE Latin, you must know all of those little bits and pieces off by heart. And I should mention, while I'm saying that if we go back to the previous page, the same thing applies to all of these verbs. Some of them have got irregular perfect stems, with this pf and a word in brackets, and you're going to have to know all of those off by heart as well, or you're really going to struggle when it comes to translating a passage. Finally, there's a small group of third declension neuter nouns which operate like opus, operis, work or deed. Again, we acquire their stems from the genitive singular by removing the is. Adjectives, describing words. Most of the adjectives we encounter at Common Entrance operate like bonus, and their endings are lovely and easy, because in the masculine, bonus, it goes like dominus. In the feminine, bona, it goes like mensa. And in the neuter, bonum, it goes like bellum. Dominus, mensa, bellum. Very straightforward. There's also a small group that end in and again, they operate like second declension nouns. Niger-type adjectives contract, pulcher, pulcra, pulcrum. So the masculine goes like magister, while the feminine and the neuter again go like mensa and bellum. There's also those like misa that don't contract, misa, misera, miserum, and so misa operates like pua in its masculine forms, and again, mensa and bellum in the feminine and the neuter. Third declension adjectives split up into two broad categories. There are some others as well, but two categories as far as you're concerned at Common Entrance. Those that work like tristis, whose stems are formed just by removing that is, and those that operate like ingens, whose stems, like with third declension nouns, have to be acquired from the genitive singular. Take ingentis and remove the is, ingent. Their endings are broadly the same as third declension nouns, except that their ablative singulars end in I instead of the letter E, and their plurals in the neuter go ia instead of a, and ium in the genitive plural. Numerals split into two categories. Ordinals are for ordering, first, second, third, and so on. All of these ordinals operate like bonus-type adjectives, because all numbers are adjectives, essentially. If I say the first soldier, or 3 kings, or something like that, 3 and first are describing those nouns. They are adjectival forms. So all of these, primus, secundus, tertius, quartus, quintus, etc., work like bonus, us, a, like dominus, mensa, and bellum. The cardinal numbers are for counting. That's like 1, 2, 3, and so on. Now, unus, duo, and tres, the numbers 1, 2, and 3, do actually have declensions. They've got full sets of endings. But you don't need to know them for Common Entrance, so don't worry about them at this stage. From quatuor, 4 onwards, they are indeclinable. So whatever the context, whatever case they're supposed to be in, they don't change. You've got to know 1 through to 10 for level 1, and if you're doing level 2, you've also got to know 11 through to 20. But they're pretty logical. Note that decem, 10, has here become decim, with the number added onto the front. Undecim, duodecim, tredecim, etc. And when you get to 18, duo de viginti, 2 away from 20. Unde viginti, 1 away from 20, and viginti is 20. Pronouns. There are several categories of these as well. Personal pronouns are for the first and second persons. I, you singular, and then in the plural, we and you plural. We don't often need them in Latin because I, you, he, she, it, and so on are contained within the endings of verbs. But they're sometimes used in the nominative for special emphasis. I am the master, you are a slave. We are Romans, but you are Greek. Something like that. And of course, we encounter them in other cases as well. Why are you wounding me with your sword? I go into the accusative there because I'm the object of the sentence, so we would need the accusative case of ego. Possessive pronouns, unsurprisingly, show possession. Who owns something? My, your singular, our, and your plural. Demonstrative pronouns, again quite logically, are for demonstrating things, pointing things out. Is, er, id is the third person pronoun. He, she, it. While hic, haec, hoc, and ille, illa, illud are demonstrative pronouns which work as adjectives. Hic means this, and ille means that. Finally, there are some reflexive pronouns. If something's reflexive, it's referring back to the subject of the sentence. So say can mean himself, herself, itself, or themselves, depending who the subject of the sentence is. Nero killed himself. We also have suis, which is a reflexive possessive pronoun. His own, her own, its own, or their own, again referring back to the subject of the sentence. The Emperor Nero killed his own mother. True story. Now, prepositions. These are words which show the relation between two elements in a sentence. They don't connect things like conjunctions, but they show how things are connected. So if I take something like, I am walking, and then the poet, we need some sort of word or a phrase to show how those two things are linked together. I am walking towards the poet, or walking with the poet, away from the poet, around the poet, etc., etc. Now, Latin prepositions have to govern a particular case. That means that whatever noun comes after them, like the poet in my example a moment ago, has to go into a particular case. The vast majority of Latin prepositions govern the accusative, including all prepositions that are to do with motion towards. So if I say against the troops, contra is against, it governs the accusative case, so troops will be accusative plural, contra copias. Likewise, through the forum. Per means through, forum would have to go into the accusative singular, which, as it's a neuter noun, is just forum. There are also, however, a handful of prepositions which govern the ablative case, including those to do with motion away from and location. And here's a list of them. A few further little irregularities. Are, ab, and ex, away from and out of, seem to have two alternative forms. That's because ab and x come before vowels and the letters h and s, while a and e come before all other consonants. Also, there can be some confusion surrounding the word with. Cum means with, as in with a person. We are going to the forum with our slaves. People, animate objects. If, however, I wanted to say, we are fighting with spears, that's called the ablative of instrument, where you're carrying out an action with some kind of inanimate object. And in that instance, you don't use cum, you simply use the ablative case by itself. One final point on prepositions. You may have noticed, if you're particularly eagle-eyed, that the word in comes up twice. In followed by the accusative, and then in followed by the ablative. It can take either case, and it has different meanings depending which case it takes. In with the accusative has a sense of motion, into or onto, while in with the ablative, a sense of location, in or on. Now we come to the final few sections in the vocabulary lists. Adverbs. An adverb describes how or when a verb takes place. Usually, in a sentence, they're located just before the verb, but if they're to do with time, they can sometimes go at the beginning of the sentence. Quite often they will end in ly in English, quickly, bravely, greatly, and so on. But actually quite a lot of them don't. Then conjunctions. There are two types of conjunction. we have subordinating conjunctions that introduce subordinate clauses, extra bits of a sentence that give us a little piece of extra information. Those are words like quod, because, quamquam, although, ubi, when, postquam, after, antequam, before. They introduce subordinate clauses. The rest of them are called coordinating conjunctions, joining words like and, but, or, and so forth. Finally, interrogatives. These are question words. The word has the same root as interrogation. It comes from rogo, I ask. Ne is the standard method of making a question. So if we had something like murum aedificatis, that would mean you plural are building a wall. If I put the little suffix ne on the end of the first word of the sentence, it turns into a question. Are you building a wall? The answer could be yes or no, and we don't know which. It's just a general question. Nonny expects the answer yes, and it can be translated in English, if a bit clunkily, with the word surely. Something like, nonne bene laboratis o puri, surely, boys, you are working well. Or perhaps better English, you are working well, aren't you, boys? Whereas nun expects the answer no, surely not. Surely you're not going to throw the boy out of the window. You're not going to throw the boy out the window, are you? Then there are a few other ordinary question words, much like we have in English. Cur is why, quid is what, quis is who, and ubi is where.